So last week was fellowship.
Jesus Christ.
This week is forgiveness of
Hello and welcome to A God We Could Believe In, a frank and honest look at Christianity as we find it today. We're going to be looking at the things the church says and does that are embarrassing, confusing, or even downright offensive. In other religious contexts, your questions might be forbidden, but not here. So whether you're a lifelong churchgoer with the scars to prove it, or you've never entered a church and are just interested in the debate, this is a safe space for you. In that spirit, we're diving headlong into questions of sex and relationships, covering topics from marriage to purity to sexuality and masturbation. We'll also be looking at issues of gender, abuse and identity, so listener discretion is advised. In particular, this episode contains references to sexual violence, rape and femicide, as depicted in the biblical text. Please look after yourselves. In today's episode, we're specifically looking at marriage in the Bible. Contemporary Christians can often be found appealing to something called the biblical doctrine of marriage, but is there such a thing? Our resident Bible scholar, Dr. Charlotte Naylor Davis, takes us on a magical mystery tour through testaments old and new to look at what examples are actually found in the Bible and on what basis such a doctrine might be constructed. I'm Tim Woodson, and alongside Charlotte, we're joined by practical theologian Simon Hall and poet, former social worker and daughter of Simon, Rachel Hall. So we are back, and today we are talking about marriage in the Bible. So I remember on my various trips through the Bible, having a look out, just trying to see if I could find an example of that perfect, wonderful Christian marriage, you know, where you meet at uni in your 20s and you go and you date for a year and then you get married and then everything's like really great and everyone celebrates it and it's lovely and chaste. And I couldn't find it. So what I thought was, Charlotte, can you help me?
Help you find a biblical model for marriage?
A nice one, yeah.
Yeah, a nice one. So, unfortunately, no.
Oh.
So
this is a very short podcast.
It's a very short podcast. Is there a model? Is there one model in the Bible? No, there isn't. We've called this episode Marriage in the Bible is a binfire, which is quite sarcastic, but partly because the Bible is always being held up. People will talk about biblical marriage as though there's one thing, and so there's one beautiful biblical marriage, so we're sort of going for the opposite joke of like, no, there isn't, it's a mess. But we really can't. So we have loads of different models of marriage across the Bible. We've got an awful lot of polygamy for a start, so in the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, and a lot of them are things that we would think of as unethical today. So that's our problem, is that we go to the Bible to look for a marriage that we want to emulate, and maybe we meet the first one and it's, you know, it's Noah and lots of things going on, or Abraham, Sarah and Hagar, awkward, not quite what we were maybe thinking of as a great romantic kind of ideal. We have to think a little bit, I guess, today about what about kind of what the Bible is and how the Bible works, instead of just looking at it for examples, although we'll talk about some examples in a minute. But I think it's worth saying that, you know, the Bible is not one monolithic text. So again, people quote kind of, in inverted commas, things being biblical as though the Bible is one thing written from the beginning to end that all fits together neatly and tidily with one great narrative. That's a really lovely idea, but reading it just disavows you of that, right? The moment you start to read it.
Quite.
What we have is lots and lots of different texts written at different periods of time to tell different types of stories. So sometimes they are moral stories, sometimes they're just history stories, sometimes they're teaching letters, you know, once we get into the New Testament. And the society that, say, St. Paul writes to in the New Testament is vastly different to the society of Abraham, Sarah and Hagar, and the kind of Canaanite, you know, we're thinking probably written at least 800 years before, and it probably happened 1,000 years before that. So we've got all of these different people writing to different contexts, just talking about marriage and relationships as they happened in their era, or to teach us something specific. And I think that's really important, is that we need to get out of this idea of thinking there is a biblical thing with a capital B, and if we distill it, we will have the key to opening it all up. So that's where we're starting today, is like, let's just know that the Bible is not doing what we want it to do.
So with that in mind, what examples of marriage are in the Bible?
So I've picked a few,
Okay.
because there's loads, but I've picked a few to kind of take us through. So we'll start at the beginning with Abraham, Sarah and Hagar, partly because like lots of Christian writers over the years, Abraham is this great man that we're meant to love and emulate. And Sarah, his wife, we're told in the New Testament that we should be like Sarah. And I know a lot of books write about Sarah as kind of like this great faithful wife to this man. Well, this man takes a concubine, he takes Sarah's handmaiden as his wife instead of Sarah because they're not having children. So we've got an example there of a man, a wife, and a third person in the marriage. So we've got polygamy, but we've also got polygamy and sex trafficking, probably. Right? So we don't get any idea of Hagar's consent to this. She is given by Sarah as property to Sarah's husband. So probably not one we think of as particularly ethical today, right? So that's one example of a marriage.
So when we hear, like, some people might have watched The Handmaid's Tale.
Yeah.
That's what this idea is. That's where this comes from.
Yeah. And a handmaiden isn't always someone that sleeps with the husband. The whole idea is she's a handmaiden to Sarah. She's her, like, best servant. But she's given. Sarah just gives her. So that's one example. Probably not one we think of as particularly ethical. We might want to think of the ones that are romantic. So we're quite often told about Jacob and Rachel and his love for Rachel, his deep love for Rachel. So he works for 7 years to gain her hand in marriage because he loves her so much. And then he doesn't get to marry Rachel. He gets tricked into marrying her sister Leah and then has to work for another 7 years for Rachel. Great, lovely romance. Oh, maybe that is the chaste thing that you wanted, was like you were looking for this. Except he marries Leah, and in that 7 years, he doesn't go, well, do you know what? This was not who I was meant to marry. So I shall save myself for the love marriage that I always wanted. Instead, he has a lot of children with Leah. In fact, Leah, we're told that that's Leah's consolation. She's been forced to marry a man she doesn't want to marry, and she knows he doesn't love her, but her consolation is that she gets children. So we're automatically into a bit of a patriarchal idea that if a woman has babies, that's all she really needs. And Jacob has more wives after that. So Jacob is polygamous and ends up with, the 12 sons that become the 12 tribes of Israel. But again, polygamy, but also tricking someone, having sex with someone who doesn't like you and that you don't like, but, worth it, get some babies. Not my favourite. Ruth and Boaz is another one, again, that is held up quite romantic. But Ruth is a widow. So it is probably the nearest we've got maybe to a romance. If you know the story, Ruth and Naomi come back to Israel because they're starving, they're widows, they have nothing to eat. They come back to Judah and they glean from Boaz's fields. He protects Ruth from being raped in the fields, which is his kind of great act of chivalry.
Bare minimum, really.
Yeah, that's right. I know, it's a very kind of like, people are like, it's so nice, isn't it? And you're like, I mean, the fact that he's allowing other women to be raped, but not this one, worries me a little bit. Maybe not the goodest of guys, but again, it's held up as a sort of like, he saves her. But again, for me, when you read that story, what you have is a situation where a woman needs to get married to be protected. She dresses herself up like a bride. She goes and offers herself to him, puts herself in a very vulnerable position. And he still goes to the nearest kinsman, who she really should be marrying, who has a right to marry her, and says, you can have her if you want. And this man says, well, actually, I can't afford another wife. So I won't, I'll pass. And so Boaz marries her. Now, there are positive and negative things about that story, but again, we're in a situation where this isn't really romantic love. This is about a practicality, and the polygamy there is kind of metered by whether you can afford multiple wives, and this man can't, so Boaz gets to marry Ruth. Really nice of him. But again, it's a different way of doing marriage. It's one of our examples of marriage. And then we have people like Samson in the book of Judges who get divorced. So far the Old Testament is not giving us, when I said it's a binfire, like, do you see what I mean? It's a bit of a binfire. We get more monogamy in the New Testament. So by the time we get to the New Testament, society has changed quite a lot. So in the New Testament, we have these couples that we would see. So we have Elizabeth and Zachariah, for example, Mary and Joseph, as far as we can tell, good monogamous couples. And we have a bit more there of like monogamy and examples of people getting married and kind of being married, staying together. So there's those kind of, it's a bit more normal by then. Priscilla and Aquila, who are a missionary couple. So we get to monogamy eventually, but it isn't the standard and it isn't everywhere. There isn't this kind of one model. The other thing that we have in the Old Testament, probably one of the few positive things, is this sexual relationship in Song of Songs. So I don't know if you read Song of Songs as a teenager in church, but I definitely did. That's the one.
Got to get it where you can, really, haven't you?
That's right. Song of Songs is like the one play everybody knows to go to Song of Songs. So we do have some positive, what I would consider more positive kind of looks at marriage that are more like what we'd recognise, I guess. We'd recognise it as a sexual relationship. We recognise that there's lust involved. There's It's not for procreation, Song of Songs. So it has a male and a female voice, which is completely radical, because basically in most of the Old Testament, we don't have female voices at all. So we don't hear about marriage from a female perspective. We get Sarah's voice. We get the pain of women who haven't had children. I think Hagar is probably it. We get Hagar running away and then choosing to go back. And that's probably the most advocacy we have of a woman of her own story.
I had a friend as a teenager who became a Christian and almost immediately came on a holiday to a Christian holiday camp called Spring Harvest. And he was quite what in the last century would have called a ladies' man. And he wasn't, fully formed into Christ-likeness. But he decided that the best way to declare his interest in a young woman was to ask her out of her room onto the balcony. This is in a Butlins in Skegness.
The most romantic places.
So kind of like Romeo and Juliet style.
Yeah.
And then just read large chunks of the Song of Songs to her.
There's nothing a woman wants more than like her thighs to be kind of compared to alabaster and her teeth to a flock of goats. That's what I'm looking for in a man.
So, but in a sense, that in his, I won't say innocent, because he knew he was doing it. He knew he was being naughty, but that's probably a more authentic way of reading.
Yeah, at least he was. Yeah,
it's like,
in.
Come on, girl, let's get it on.
Let's get it on. Like, it's like wooing and it's desire and I mentioned Taylor, like we've had women's voices before, but they are generally kind of to do with the difficult situations they're in. And Song of Songs is a very upbeat text. In Hebrew, it's very explicit, it's very sexual, and I hate to tell people it's probably not a metaphor for Christ and the church. Partly because the more you read it and the more you study it, the less you want it to be.
Right.
For Christ and his relationship to the church. That's a very Puritan's not knowing what to do with sex reading of Song of Songs. But it's an important one, right? Because it is one of the places where various scholars suggest that we do genuinely have the voice of a woman. So we may have a female writer, and there are very few places in scripture where we think women are writing, and this may be one of them. But yeah, it's a funny one. People like to keep it hidden still, and there are a number of reasons. One is it's sex outside of marriage,
right?
Which we talked about in the last episode. It's not something we like to promote, so we keep that. The other is it's definitely sex for fun, not procreation, because we have her being given herbs by her kind of like her crew of women, her entourage, and they give her herbs which we know are abortifacients. We know that they are.
Oh, that's what that's about.
Yeah, so they give her the stuff that's like, so you can go and do this free and easy. Like, let's they know. And again, that was one of the things that makes people think maybe it has got an authentic women's voice in it, because these are things that generally men aren't passed on by men, they're passed on by women as knowledge of like, what are the herbs we need to be taking? Because women have been taking birth control for centuries. We just didn't tell you about it because we weren't allowed. But again, it's not a standard model of marriage. There's lots of things in it that disobey even kind of what would have been considered at the time sort of the correct rules. And it reads like erotica. So, and reads like other erotica we've got from the same period. So, it's not a kind of great religious text. It is a piece of erotica right there in your Bible.
Yeah, yeah. Well, hey, there you go. I mean, one of the things that strikes me about all that, and from my reading of the thing as well, is that marriage seems to be very transactional.
Yep.
Very much about property and possession and power. And very patriarchal, I guess. Yeah,
very much so. So most of our marriage teaching, where there is specific teaching on how you look after a wife, for example, we might want to think, well, there must be laws around this. There's laws around everything, right? There's laws around mildew, so there must be laws about marriage. The marriage laws that we have, or the kind of the teaching around marriage, tends to be very much transactional, and it's about possessions. So we're in a patriarchy in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, patriarchies that work in different way, but still hierarchies that privilege maleness, privilege things that are traditionally masculine, and people in, for want of a better term, kind of like cis male bodies. Those are the best bodies you can be in. That's what we want you to be in. And we're going to privilege all of that. And they're usually about things like how you know who's the father of a child. A woman can give birth to lots of people's different babies with different fathers. Marriage is one of the ways you control that.
Okay.
So marriage is one of the ways that if I own you, then I know all those children are mine.
Yeah.
And I know who they've come from. And even if you did, and to be honest, in like legally, even if you did give birth to another man's child, it's still my child because I own you. And your body is owned by me. So we see that play out in really specific ways. So Hagar's children are Abraham's and belong to Abraham and Sarah because Abraham and Sarah own Hagar. There's a horrible, horrible passage in Judges. There's not many nice passages in the book of Judges, to be honest, but it's not, from a feminist perspective, it's not the greatest book in the Bible. But there's a passage where this guy Jephthah makes a vow to God that he'll sacrifice the first thing that he sees when he comes back from war. And the first thing he sees is his daughter. So he sacrifices his daughter. He mourns what he's going to lose. And he doesn't mourn her. He mourns his progeny. He mourns the fact that he now won't, his line will end, that he's sacrificed the end of his line. So in a patriarchy, those are the things that are primarily important to you. You know, we see a lot of that stuff in the Psalms. We want people have cut me off from my line. So that's how patriarchy's working, and that means that women are an exchangeable commodity in there, and they serve that purpose. And so their voice, their consent isn't important because they are less important, which again makes Song of Songs quite radical, but it also, you can see the pain of it, particularly in Genesis. You'll see women naming their children for like, I named him, you know, they name him Sorrow and Bitterness, and, you know, like, because they like, it's very kind of, because it really matters. And also patriarchy gives you protections if you are married and have children. So where it works for women is you can claim certain rights if you are married or, you know, or you have children, because then you're valuable. So that's how you get value. So you've got to play within it. Ruth and Boaz, again, you got to play that game, play the patriarchy game and try and win, is to be married, have some babies.
And I think there's something about the clarity and certainty of where everyone fits. You know, at the moment, I believe the young people who look at social media that they tell me that there's this thing called a trad wife. Which is, you know, one is particularly in America, it's this kind of assertion that all of this freedom that we have has led us to a loss of certainty in our own identity. And if we can find a way to return to those really secure roles in society, then that's actually better for us than the kind of, you get to invent yourself. It's just too much hard work.
That is true. The rules were clear. I think one of the things that we have to be really careful of when we're looking at the ancient world is still understanding who's writing these texts. And they're usually written, with a slightly rose-tinted glasses, unless they're trying to teach you a moral point. But also what we're usually talking about when we look at those laws is people who are wealthy in a particular way. Polygamy is for the wealthy. Most people aren't doing it. They can't do it. But also, maybe you've got a secure role as a woman, but you don't get a say in it. So the idea that you can choose to be a trad wife is a lovely thing, but that's not what any of what's happening in the ancient world, in the ancient Near East. It's certainly not what's happening in our New Testament Greco-Roman world. You don't get to choose as a woman which of those roles you have. And also, when we then think about poverty and we think about indentured servitude or we think about enslaved people, they don't get that choice either. So they can be sold, moved on. Your husband can get rid of you. You can't say anything about it. And when we think about how that transferred, I mean, it's, again, patriarchy is very much the mode in which we are still living, but in the 20th century, that's still the case, right? So until the Equality Acts in the sort of 1970s in the UK, as a woman, you still, why did our grandparents stay together for so long? They were so good at marriage. Or women couldn't leave, because if you leave, you have no land, you have no property, you have no freedom, you have no money. So yeah, you can win at patriarchy as a woman, you can win inside of it, but your choices are not the same as a man's choices, which have the freedom to, you know, and Jesus comments on that. You know?
Yeah. So if these are the sort of structures that are modelled, set up in the Bible, are we to assume that that is how God wants it to be?
I think the fact that we haven't got one model, for me, indicates that maybe the Bible isn't trying to teach us to emulate all of those. Right. So I feel like if I were writing a Bible now, for example, you know, L. Ron Hubbard style, if I'm writing it, I'd write these are the clear rules of how you do marriage. This is the God-ordained way of doing it. I don't think that's what the Hebrew Bible texts are doing. They are either describing a time from the past, so they're just telling the stories of their people. So, the Bible is a very biased document. It's centered on Israel, and Israel is not talking about the whole world. It's just talking about those people.
Yeah.
Or they're trying to, Ruth and Boaz, for example, I've been quite mean about Ruth. One of the things it's meant to teach you is that you can, as God's people, include the outsider, and it will lead to something good, and that God can. So, these are meant to teach you something, but they're not necessarily meant to teach you how to do marriage.
Yeah.
And probably because marriage is such a normal thing in most societies, it's just running along outside it, that what we have is extraordinary moments. People aren't just telling you about how everybody does marriage. So I personally think no. The New Testament is slightly different. We might want to talk about that in particular. But even in the New Testament, there's a lot of nuance about kind of what's actually being talked about, and whether the passages on marriage are how to do marriage, or whether they're really about something else, and marriage is an example because it's such a ubiquitous thing.
I got to know a rabbi in Leeds. She was called Esther, which tells you that she was at the kind of reform end of Judaism because she was a woman. And she taught on Esther, which was great. But at the end of this session, I asked her, what's the weirdest thing about the way that Christians read your scriptures? And she said, well, for us, first of all, there are family story. They're almost like gossip, and we imagine them being passed down like gossip. Like, do you remember when Uncle Bert, got drunk at a wedding and did something that he shouldn't do to Auntie Flo? And we tell it, first of all, just because it happened and it's our story. And it's amusing to us when we see Christians taking the story of Uncle Bert and trying to imagine that this story was passed on to, give us some insight into the character of God.
Yeah.
Or that somehow we've been told this story because Uncle Bert did something important. He just got drunk at a wedding.
Yeah.
But it's it's one of those stories that people tell because that was what happened at that wedding and it was what everybody talked about. So that's what we remembered. And it doesn't mean that there aren't other deeper levels going on in the story, but it just helped me remember that, as you say, these stories about marriages were probably not told to teach us what marriage is like.
Yeah.
The marriage is just part of the story.
Yeah, and I think, so if you look at rabbinical teaching, which comes after our New Testament is written, but the rabbis are always debating what we're meant to do with these various bits of scripture. And Christians, particularly, I would say in kind of evangelicalism, but in Protestantism, are desperate for every part of scripture to have a good point. Like, we've taken that weird verse in Timothy, is it, about it being God-breathed?
Yeah.
And gone, so it must all be positive. And some of it's just negative. Like, maybe you're meant to look at Abraham, where he lies about whether Sarah is his sister or his wife to get out of kind of, basically to save his own skin. Maybe you're meant to look at it and think Abraham's bad. But we can't fathom that. So we go, right, we've got to find a theology that adds it all up and makes it all nice. And I think there's a fear sometimes that if we admit that there isn't one biblical way of doing marriage, then somehow we've undermined Jesus at all, instead of thinking that gives us a new way of being able to understand the Bible. But yeah, listen.
I just want to say your Samson example and Judges as a whole is a perfect cleanse for that particular ideology. There is nothing you can do with Judges. Don't try. It's horrible. I've got to be honest, I love it because up to that point you've just been wading through laws for ages. Then you get to Judges and it's like, whoa. And it's wonderful. But yes, you can do nothing useful with it.
Yeah, Judges is hard read. Like, there's a point where I was studying Judges in a class. There's a point where we come in one week and we go like, well, it can't get any worse than this. Next week we turn the page. Oh yeah, there it is. It's got worse. And even the ending of it. But it is an example of a text that is written quite neutrally. Like, it's a weird read because, again, as a Christian, you're sort of taught to think, well, this must be telling me something. And Judges is just like, this happened, then this happened. These awful things happened.
Yeah.
And that's the book. It ends with, and it was a time of judges, and there were no kings in Israel.
Yeah. It's a great big crescendo of horror by the end. Isn't it?
But yeah, by the end, and if you want to see patriarchy play out to the nth degree, this person has sexually assaulted my concubine to death. Therefore, we will go and steal more women and take them for our own. I mean, that's a heck of a patriarchal revenge. Like, how are we gonna? It plays it out to go. I don't think that God wants us to emulate the Book of Judges. There are many things I'll theologically say. I'm very clear on this, but I am quite clear, I think.
Yeah.
But it's a good, go and read it. I think quite often we haven't read enough of our Bible. I mean, I would say that because I'm a biblical scholar, but I think people don't read their Bible enough. And then people are allowed to say things like, biblically, this is what this is, or the Bible is clear that marriage is X. And it's like, you haven't read it if that's what you're saying. And that doesn't mean you have to throw it out. Mm-hmm. There's loads to be learnt from it. But just maybe take a cursory glance at, the beginnings of the first few chapters of Genesis. Maybe read Judges. Have a look around. Read Song of Songs. Have a look around. Yeah. And then see whether you can just be like, oh, yeah, maybe the Bible is not clear.
So what's in the New Testament then? People often appeal to Paul a lot when they talk about marriage.
So a number of things have shifted. So I think we need to think about the context, the historical context of our New Testament text. So the Old Testament is written over quite a long period of time. And mainly it's talking about Israel, and we start kind of in Canaan and things. We get a lot of polygamy. And then people will look at the New Testament and go, well, clearly that was the Old Testament, so we don't have to think about it as Christians, but the New Testament is really clear. Society has moved and changed quite a lot. And the world of the New Testament is both Jewish, because these quite often are our Jewish writers, sometimes writing to Gentiles, sometimes writing to Jews, but it's also Greco-Roman, very Hellenized. There's a lot of discussion going on in kind of the Greco-Roman world about religion and love and marriage and philosophy. Like, this is the world in which we enter kind of with our writers. And Paul particularly is a well-educated Jewish man who also has had Greco-Roman education. So his writing kind of emulates the monogamy that's around at the time. If you were well-to-do, you were probably monogamous, because that's how the Romans thought. It was idealised. Didn't necessarily mean you never had sex outside of marriage, or adultery wasn't a thing, but, writers like to write about the ideal, don't they? So there's a Roman ideal of romance and monogamy, and this is the world into which our kind of texts are written, but still very patriarchal. So you can be emancipated as a woman legally. If you're a rich woman, we've got lots of documents of rich women who live on their own stuff, but most women are still very much under the kind of what is in Roman society called patria potestas, which is the power of the father in a house. So your dad owns everything, and he gets to say who marries who and who does what, and not until he dies does that. These old guys who are ruling everything. So again, it's still a very different life for the poor and the enslaved, who Paul does write to and about. So that's the sort of world we're in. And people appeal to Paul because, well, one of the things he says, for example, is that the best thing you can do is not marry. Because the best thing is a person who's not married, because they can concentrate on the Lord. Marriage for him seems like a big old distraction, and sex definitely is. Like, it's a big distraction away from what the Lord will want you to do. But if you have to get married, marry a Christian. And make sure that you're not doing anything sexually immoral. Those are his terms. He uses immorality and morality. So sexual immorality is an issue for him. And he's very concerned with those kind of boundaries of what is moral and what keeps you holy and what doesn't. And so people like to use Paul. He's really good for taking a quote out of context. He's your best guy for that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, just pick one out and go, oh, see, wives, submit to your husbands. And you're done. Like, there you go. That's how marriage works. So that's kind of where we are.
But that's because he thinks the world's going to end any day now. Because he also says, if you're married to someone who's not a Christian, don't leave them. Don't divorce them unless they really, really want to get divorced.
Yeah, unless you don't know, you might save them. He says this weird thing about you might save them and your children just by being there.
In his context, marriage it's not bad. No. It's not like so bad that you should get unmarried.
No.
But It's like we've got more important things to do
Yeah.
until Jesus comes back, which could be next week.
Could be next week. And it seems to be next Tuesday. Jesus is coming back. So in Corinthians, which is the big text that people use quite often, he teaches that some really positive things. So he says, husbands, your body isn't your own, it's your wives'. Wives, your body isn't your own, it's your husband's. Seems quite nice. So that's quite a good one. But then, like I say, he also has this whole passage where he talks about how you should behave towards your virgin. So when I say we're still in a patriarchal society, that whole section in 1 Corinthians 7, I think it is clearly directed at men.
Yeah.
How should you treat a woman to stay within the bounds of morality? There's no voice of the women there. If you can't control yourself, men, marry her. Because better to be married than to, burn with passion and, that'll kill you. That would be dreadful. That would be the worst thing. Or to do something immoral, which for him, again, in this kind of Greco-Roman monogamy, also like sexual desires are being quite pushed down as like you're meant to be able to kind of elevate yourself against your base desires. So that's part of the world that he's also thinking around and he's inside of. So then what he's trying to do is work out, well, what place does Christ have in it? And what that does is it makes Christ the master of everything. So Christ becomes the most important person in your relationships. So that section that I said was quite nice and equal comes after a section about how Christ should be the only master that you have. So Christ is the head of everything, and then everything else fits underneath it.
Right.
And he's trying to fit the way that the Corinthians do sexual relationships and marriage, and they get divorced sometimes, and sometimes they don't marry people, and sometimes they have sex outside of marriage. He's trying to say, stay as holy as you can until Jesus comes back. And that's what he's trying to figure out. And the way that he does that is to couch it in those terms of marriage, but again, quite patriarchal. Stay married if you can. Wives, don't divorce people. Stay under your husband. Stay in this kind of hierarchy because there's no point messing with it. And inside of that teaching comes the other teaching of the household as well, which is slaves don't try and be free. Right? I mean, this is the sort of evidence for, do we think it's set up for the rest of time? Probably not.
No.
It's a bad teaching to have, to give to people, to not get married and also to stay enslaved if you're trying to set up a religion for all time. But Paul's trying to set up holiness till next week.
Yeah.
Which is a different context to a religion for all time. Again, is Paul's teaching something that we can take and just randomly apply to our lives? I think we have to be a little careful because his teaching about slavery and enslaved people is something that we would find quite abhorrent. This is not the household that you and I are used to. We don't live in that world, hopefully. And so that contextualizes some of Corinthians. Ephesians and Colossians are the bits that people quote to kind of quite often to keep women in check and to keep the kind of gender roles in check. So in Ephesians and Colossians, there are these things called the household codes. And the way they run is they're instructions to the husband, instructions to the wife, instruction to the children, instructions to the slaves. And they work down like that. So husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. Wives, submit to your husband in all things as to the Lord. And that's the bit that I find difficult to read. And it's also a bit that that we have used to great detriment in the church and is still being used to encourage people to stay with their abusive partners, because there's whole sections of teaching, you can find it. I studied some in my master's of if the wife stays and is a good and obedient and submits, that will change the man by default because they'll be doing what God wants and therefore God will honour that by changing their husband in some way. It's really dangerous teaching to use out of context. In its context, again, we have these quotes earlier in the letter about equality in Christ. And then suddenly we have this list of like definite inequality. I mean, it's definitely inequality. We have to figure out what we do with that. In its historical context, what the writer of Ephesians, Paul or not Paul, depending, that's a whole other thing. Go Google that. I can't go into it here. But the writer of Ephesians, what they seem to be doing is trying to figure out how do they apply their new freedom in Christ to this household, which is the way it is. There's no sense there of we're trying to change marriage laws. There's no campaign. This isn't a kind of like a great campaign for women's rights or anything like that. We think that God works in this way and Jesus has come, so everybody is equal in Christ. But we still live in this world that has this layer of this way of doing marriage. So how should you run your house in a perfectly normal way, but also with Jesus added in? And what happens is this word submit rather than obey.
Right.
So submit for a woman is a voluntary thing. You can only ever voluntarily submit. You can't, like, if you're forced into it, that's obedience. It's not submission. I submit to you by saying, do you know what? Over to you. I give that away. That's a consent. So it adds that. And what it does is it modifies the father rule by borrowing really from kind of sort of other teaching that's around, the Epicureans and people like that, and saying a good father looks after the wife, is nice to the children, is a good master to their enslaved people. I mean, how good a person are you if you've got slaves is a question we might want to think about, but it's a modification. What it isn't is a great kind of new set of rules, again, for all time, that sets up some sort of beautiful Christ-like utopia in this household. Because what it does is it says, yeah, keep your slaves, but if you're going to have them, be a good slave owner, which is very awkward and has been used throughout history as one of the reasons why we should be allowed to keep slaves, because the Bible has slaves.
Yeah.
So would it be a better way to think about it as that now relationships are different, both sexual relationships and employment relationships are different? Should we then say, well, this is the world that we live in, and how do the values of Christ mean that we live in these networks of relationships in a slightly different way?
Yeah, because I think that's what we see our New Testament writers doing. I think what we see them doing is going, so if Christ exists, and so for Paul, if, Christ has made us all equal, there's no Jew, no slave, no slave, no free, no male, no female, no Jew, no Greek, right? He makes this great statement, but then he still has this teaching about the household. One is a theological truth for all time, and another is a sociological reality for now. And the sociological reality for now doesn't undo the theology for all time. It's just how it's applied. We like to not differentiate between the two types of statements. So we like to go, well, Paul said this, and we're happy with this equality thing. That must mean that this teaching on the house is also a teaching of equality, when actually it's an application in that context. One really good kind of way to approach New Testament letters particularly is we do this thing called mirror reading. It's not perfect. There's lots and lots of problems with it, but as a tool to ask yourself, what is the question this writer had been asked that prompted this letter to be written, is a really good, because these are letters from a real person to real people, from two people who know one another as well. I write to you knowing that you know me, so I can shorthand some stuff.
Yeah.
Oh, my friend will know the difference between Charlotte on a feminist rant and Charlotte talking about her favourite way to make dinner. That maybe one doesn't necessarily fit with feminist principles, but both things are true. You'd know me not enough to be like, oh yeah, she's just started talking recipes now.
Very patriarchal cooking style.
That's right. That's right. Come on, Charlotte. Well, actually, I mean, it is funny. In my marriage, I did most of the cooking. I was a better cook at the time, probably not now, but and again, one doesn't undermine the other, because I practically do all the cooking in my house doesn't mean I don't believe the principle that women shouldn't do all the cooking.
Yeah.
And we've got that going on. We've got real people writing to real people. So one of the questions that's really continuously asked of kind of particularly, say, Corinthians, we know that second half of Corinthians, Paul literally says, now about the things that you wrote.
Yeah.
So they've written to him and gone, what do we do about marriage? What do we do about haircuts? He's really obsessed with haircuts. What do we do about haircuts? What do we do about how we eat the Lord's Supper? What do we do? And he's answering them in the way that you would give advice to someone you know. He's not saying, well, we should do this for the rest of time. In fact, he says quite clearly in 1 Corinthians, about this I've got a rule of the Lord. And then about other things, marriage, he says, I don't have a rule of the Lord. So I haven't got anything specific from Jesus about this, but this is my tradition.
Best interpretation.
This is how I do it.
So, Rachel, I remember you once saying to me that one of the problems is that because the church is like, well, outside of marriage, we have nothing to say about sex because the only marriage that we can talk about is sex inside a straight marriage. We have nothing to say about, is there a Christ-like way of cohabiting, or is there a Christ-like form of queer marriage? We actually limit these kind of conversations of how do these principles apply in everybody's lives by the box that we put it in, which, if you're right, Charlotte, that box was never nailed down with the lid on it, even in the time that the scriptures were being written.
No. I think as well, like, as a biblical scholar, I feel like I have to be honest here. I don't think Paul, if we transported St. Paul from the 1st century to now, would be looking around at the way we do marriage, cohabiting, queer relationships and going, that's what I consider sexual morality. He is a 1st century Greco-Roman Jew, and he has the biases and prejudices that come with that. And he's a male Jew. And he comes from a particular type of Judaism. So Judaism's quite varied in the 1st century. He comes from a particular type. He comes from Pharisaism. So he's got particular ideas about what relationships are. And they are very heteronormative. And they are based in kind of ideals of getting married and that being where purity and holiness is. But that doesn't mean that Paul thinks he's writing for all time. And it also doesn't mean that the way that, say, the household is described in Ephesians is the ideal godly household. And again, I'd bring us back to those bits about slavery. I said to you, the ideal godly household has slaves in it because Ephesians. You would hopefully pull me up on that because it undoes the bodily autonomy and humanity of a whole section of people. And so I think we get to look at the New Testament and say, from where Paul was, these were the lines that he could draw about what morality is and isn't. And also here's the theology that he's working under, which is more universal. Then how do we negotiate that? And it is a negotiation. I'm quite happy to be honest about that. I read the Bible in a particular way, which is because I'm so aware of its context, I then have to work out what I apply to my life. And some people might immediately just think that is too far, and I get that. But literalism doesn't work either, because if you want to be literal, then you have to say slaves are fine.
Yeah.
And we've all agreed that actually, in a decent world, and a godly world, I hope, that we don't undo the bodily autonomy and humanity of a whole group of people. So that's a kind of very heavy way of doing it, but I think it is something we have to think about. We can't just be contextual. We don't want to throw it all away, but we also can't just be literal, because that leads us to a place that, is abhorrent to me anyway. And I then think as well, let's think about the fact that, like I say, he mainly speaks to men about what they're doing. He's speaking to this household that has this structure that we know took away the bodily autonomy of women. And do we want to do that? Even in our most conservative, my most conservative friends, the women tend to believe in their own bodily autonomy. And that's not the world that Paul's talking to either. Once you were married, like, you belong to your husband. So if that's what he's holding up, that should give us pause at least to think, how do I want to apply the wider principles? And the wider principles in, say, 1 Corinthians are equality before God, of everybody, of needing to search for each other's holiness and wholeness. That's 1 Corinthians 12. In Ephesians, it's about freedom and being able to act in a Christ-like way in a culture that is not Christ-like. How do we do that? Those are all good questions for marriage, but taking the New Testament out of context and just placing it on top of our modern society, I think there's a lot of conservative readers that would lose what they love about their own marriages. Again, the trad wife thing is a really perfect example. I should be allowed to choose to be a trad wife. Yeah, you should, but let's not go too far down that road, because you don't get to choose.
Well, I was going to ask about what you were saying about submission and obedience, and the difference between those two things. And, like, with submission, is there then a level of consent. So can a wife choose to be submissive? And when I think of submission, I think of somebody being passive, and that feels scary to me. And if we're looking at, like, if that teaching is in the New Testament, and from what we've discussed, divorce is maybe a bit more common and women maybe have a bit more say at that point. But obviously the context before that is, don't get divorced because you won't have a home, you won't have money, you have absolutely no way of taking care of yourself without your husband. And I was just wondering a little bit, like, that's the conversation that I have over and over and over again with my friends. And some of my friends chose to say submit in their marriage vows. And I'm like, why did you do that?
Yeah.
And I just wonder maybe if you could speak a little bit about, because I don't hear obedience as much, but I hear submit a lot.
Yeah.
And where you think choice and consent come into that.
So it's really complex, isn't it? I mean, in general, I'd never teach that passage. Because I think the pastoral weight of it is too big. I think if I say from the front, wives, submit to your husbands, I offer an abuser a tool with which to bully their partner. So for me, it's become a thing that I would that's just a kind of an aside, but like it's a really dangerous passage because without going really deep into it, you hand somebody a stick to beat somebody with. You promise to submit. I want you to do this. I want you to submit. And also, you're not being a good, godly wife if you don't choose to submit. This is, you can wheel people's choices against them, right? So, in theory, I would say in its like rawest context, it has a level of positivity, and people are too heavy about how positive it is. It has a level of positivity because it is the word submit and not the word obey. So the writer doesn't say, wives, obey your husbands and do whatever they say. What the writer's doing is modifying the role of wife. From one which is, what's a godly wife, a Christ-like wife? She isn't one who just has to obey her husband. She's somebody who chooses to. In the same way that, and I think this is where those parallels come in the same way that they encourage the enslaved person, to obey their master. So I think we need to get that context right, because the wife and the child parallel what's happening with the enslaved person. And so what we're saying is, in a situation that you can't change, what is the godly way to be in that situation? In our context and the way that it's then been taken and used, I would never encourage someone. It would never be what I said, because we lose that sense of, this is the only choice you have. How do you approach it in a Christ-like manner? But it's a concession. It's not a rule. Am I being clear? Because I think, there's a massive danger with that passage of seeing it as, so the way for you to change your husband, and it's like, no, the husband has his own rule, and the husband's rule is that he should be loving the wife in the way that Christ loved the church and laid his life down for her. And in theory, and this is why I've heard it preached, and I've heard it preached badly so many times, because people say it's okay to ask women to submit if you're telling men that they have to lay down their life for their wife. But it's not. These are two separate rules for two separate people. My submission is based on myself. It's not, you don't get to ask me to submit. You don't get to choose that for me. But also it's a context in which we would now say is a really unhealthy rule of marriage, which is one where I have no choice but to be here. So if I have no choice but to be here, like the enslaved person in exactly the same passage, then he encourages the enslaved Christian to be a good slave, because maybe that way he will win over his master. And if you're a slave master, be a good slave master. But these are concessions to living in a world that is set up not like, in effect, not in a Christ-like way. It feels to me like the Christ-like way would be to not have to be enslaved. But if I have to be enslaved, then I try to follow God inside my enslavement. Now, I've never been an enslaved person, and I'm not even willing to talk to that. But it's a very dangerous teaching, and it's very nuanced, I think. I don't think it's a setup. Like I say, I don't think it's a setup for the whole of creation. There is a consent issue, I guess, because there is a matter of, can I inside of this take any of myself back? That I become someone who chooses to submit instead of being forced to obey. But that is inside of this, and I worry about teaching that. I worry always about teaching that encourages that for women, because what it seems to say to them, and it has been used like this, and I've seen it used like this, is stay where you are in this abuse and submit to your husband. Well, we don't live in that sociological reality anymore. You don't have to that, you can leave. Like, we can find ways. We should be setting up, hopefully, churches that allow people freedom and support, that when something is abusive or in kind of any way, that they can leave it because we will have their back. Whereas that is not the situation for a woman in the first century in Corinth, or the first century in Ephesus. So again, that's where that contextual stuff really matters, because is Paul speaking to our world? No. And I've got other options.
Yeah.
And we've got other options for people, and hopefully other options for people who are enslaved or trafficked, hopefully other options for children. Again, the teaching to the children is like, be a good child so you don't anger your parents. Well, we know more about childhood now. We're not expecting children to just be half people, half human until they come of age. And I don't know if that answered your question, but like, I think there is something about consent, and that word submit matters. But I also think that the context matters. And as a woman, you can choose to submit to your husband if you want in your marriage, and choose that he's going to be the person that makes the decisions about X, Y, and Z. But it is submission. It's not obey. I mean, we've taken obey out of the vows a long time ago. People still say them, and it just makes me sad when anybody promises to obey their husband because it's not biblical. Again, I mean, that's why I kind of make the difference between submission and obedience. Is because when people say to you, do you want to say love, honour and obey in your marriage vows? Well, there's nothing biblical about obeying your husband. Submitting maybe, but again, no. I mean, my advice to anyone would be, just don't teach on that passage. Like, you don't have to. And you don't want to teach people that they have to stay in enslavement. And women were basically chattel. Like, they legally were chattel. And the deists bring this up in 1750. Mary Wollstonecraft writes Vindication of the Rights of Women. And one of the things that she talks about is how women are listed as chattel. They're the ownership of men. And that's why she won't get married. It's not even a new debate. It's been happening a really long time. But yeah, we're not owned anymore. And therefore you're not in a situation where you can't leave. And therefore you are allowed to leave.
Thanks, Charlotte. That was really interesting, and helps make sense of why I couldn't find anything useful in the Bible about marriage. So
I wish we were filming this for a fantastic YouTube clip. just that tiny little thing that would go viral.
Little snippet.
Yeah. So in the next episode, Simon, you're going to take us through a bit of a potted history of where we have got our idea of marriage from.
Yeah, well, obviously, if trying to do everything that the Bible says about marriage in one podcast isn't crazy enough, in the next one, we're going to do 2,000 years of history of how those ideas in the Bible then shaped the church, and how the church shaped particularly Western European ideas of what sex and relationships and marriage were about.
Can't wait. Thank you so much for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, then please make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcasts to make sure you don't miss an episode. Episodes are released every other Monday, and next up is our Q&A episode on Monday 10th November. We're sure you'll have lots of questions for Charlotte, so please get your questions to us by Friday 31st of October to feature. You can message us at agodwecouldbelievin@gmail.com or via our socials. In our next full episode, Simon picks up where Charlotte left off to explore the evolution of Christian marriage to its present-day context. Lastly, a reminder, if you'd like to support the project, make sure you share it with your friends, family, or any poltergeists that happen to be hovering around this spooky season, and you can patronise us by subscribing to agodwecouldbelievin.substack.com. Here you'll also receive bonus episodes and regular reflections from Simon and the team right to your inbox. We'll see you again very soon.